since India undertook that biggest monetary exercise, a month since demonetization. And let's get you a view that matters all the way from New Delhi. Member of Niti Aayog and one of the best economic commentators that I know of, Professor Bibek Debroy joins us live right here on ET Now. Thanks very much, Professor Debroy, for being with us. 30 days since that big announcement was made that really seems to have changed our spending patterns, that seems to have changed how we hoard cash, that seems to have changed the lines outside ATMs. But let me ask you, at the end of this entire exercise, at the end of the 30 months on, what have we achieved? One of the big purposes was to clamp down on black money. Have we done that? I mean, what are the lists of achievements that you will enlist right now?
Well, I think the first thing I'd like to say is that 8th of November, or what happened on the 8th of November, is part of a broader set of measures that the government is seeking to introduce, including those that are meant to prevent the creation of new black income, also measures to address black wealth, existing stock of black wealth that's not in the form of cash. At the moment, what has happened is, depending on what base level figure you use, whether it is 14 lakh crores or 16 lakh crores, a substantial amount has already come into the banking system. But that is not quite the same thing as saying that this has been legitimized, because whether the money that has come in, whether that's black, whether that's been legitimized or not, is subject to further scrutiny.
That's an interesting point that you're talking about, and you've actually prompted me to my next question, because the RBI said that 11.5 lakh crore rupees has come back to the system as of yesterday. I'm sure that figure is higher today. When you say that all the money that has come back may not be legitimate money, is there an estimate that the government has on what portion of this could be illegitimate, could be black money? Because many people wonder, if 11.5 or 12 or 13 actually end up coming back to the system, was this an exercise in futility then?
Well, if you compare that figure of 11 lakh crores or 11.5 lakh crores, you ought not to be comparing it with the balance sheet figure, which is an old figure of 14 lakh crores of high denomination notes that were in circulation. You should compare it with the actual figure on the 8th of November, which is 16 lakhs. So, out of that 16 lakhs, let's say 11.5 has come back. My assessment, and this is purely my individual assessment, I don't think the government has any assessment on this, is that a substantial amount that was going to come back has already come back. So, although technically we are going to wait, we need to wait till the end of December, indeed a little bit further beyond that. I think we will be still left with at least 3 lakh crores, if not 4 lakh crores, which will not return. So, as a percentage, this was more or less what commentators expected not to return in the system.
So, Debroy, if that 3 to 4 or 2.5 to 3 lakh doesn't come back to the system, will that be the mark or the metric of success of demonetization? There's a reason why I ask you that, because a lot of people believe while you are perhaps going to be able to curb the black money that was lying in cash in the system, you haven't really been able to crack down on the stock, the money that's lying in real estate or in gold or in other forms, which is not in cash. And so, two questions there. The metric of the success, if 3.5 come back, is that a metric of success? And B, the argument that people are making, how are you attacking black money really?
No, I am going to contest both of those, which is why I began by saying that some of those other things, including the existing black stock that is in other forms, will be addressed through other means. And one of the things I am going to mention is the Benami Properties Act, which has been pending for a very, very long time. So, 8th of November is only part of that broader picture. So far as 8th of November is concerned, that 3 lakh crores or 4 lakh crores or whatever the figure is not the only metric of success. Because I will reiterate what I said earlier, that just because the money has come into the system does not mean that it has become legitimized, because we know there has been a lot of misuse, and one will have to wait for the detailed scrutiny to see how much of that is truly black, to the extent that black has come into the system, it will now be subjected to the tax and the penalty. So that itself is a metric of success, because what was outside the system has now been brought back into the system and has been forced to come into the tax net.
Professor Debroy, it's an interesting point that you're making, that a lot of the money that has come back may not be legitimized money, and there may still be a lot of tax that could be accrued from that money that has come back. But the contrapoint to this entire thing is, and if you may allow me the liberty to actually quote, as it were, the hotbed of corruption, and it doesn't take an erudite economist like you to realize and to say it, the hotbed of corruption is really the last mile tax guy, the man who can actually end up penalizing. Have we in this entire process unleashed the state, unleashed the tax guy on the doors of every Indian?
That's a very, very legitimate question to ask, and I would react to it in the following way, that there is indeed a danger of the so-called Inspector Raj being unleashed, particularly at the lower levels. I would say two things therefore. Firstly, on the personal income tax side, there has already been some simplification even before the 8th of November, particularly in the matter of scrutiny, appeals, refunds, etc., etc. In the present case also, I am sure that the government will take measures to ensure that in the process there isn't harassment of genuine people who might suffer from the additional scrutiny. I am sure that scrutiny will be targeted only to people against whom it needs to be directed.
I do not know how you're going to ensure that, because that's really going to be the test of the government having ensured that the taxman doesn't go hounding an honest citizen who may have perhaps deposited legitimate cash in the banks. But Professor Debroy, you are an economist, and I can't not ask you the repercussions or the impact this is going to have on overall economic activity and growth. Just yesterday, the RBI lowered its fiscal year 17 growth target, yes, on account of Q2 dip in growth, but also 10 to 15 basis points on account of demonetization. One doesn't have the figures to still assess the impact of growth. As one of India's best economists, what do you think is going to be the impact on economic growth and also on economic activity? You can't deny this is going to dent it, at least in the short term.
I'm not denying anything, but all I would like to say is that GDP is a very, very specific concept. It's a very specific concept, and not only is GDP a very specific concept, gross value added is an even more specific concept. And what the RBI has lowered is the estimate of gross value added, the growth rate in gross value added. Today, to estimate the impact of what happened on the 8th in terms of GDP is not very easy, because one really has no data on the basis of which to make such an assertion. So, anyone who is citing a figure is citing a figure that is not backed up with any proper analysis. I think the first time we will have a handle on what is going on is when we have the figures on indirect tax collections, which will be fairly soon. I would argue that yes, there is going to be an impact in Q3 of this year. I suspect that the impact in Q4 of this year is not going to be that much, and this will be more than compensated by an increase in next year. Because this is a channel which specializes in business programs, let me also make the following point. A lot of transactions that people are pointing to are actually transfer payments from the point of view of GDP. The second point I am going to make is, as I said, this is value added, and value added depends on the value of output and the value of inputs also. And the last point is, whenever one is talking about GDP growth, this is real GDP growth or real GVA growth. So, there is a numerator and there is a denominator. In talking about the impact on GDP, people are focusing on the numerator, but to the extent the prices come down, the denominator also comes down. That's the reason I am hedging about what happens to GDP, because I don't know.
Indeed, you don't know, but I'm sure you have done a back of the envelope calculation, because FMCG companies have been on record to say that 50% of their sales are down, ad spends are down. I'm just trying to assess the impact this is going to have on economic activity. And if I may also add to that, demand has been crippled. When do you see demand bounce back?
Demand has been crippled, says who? Because the only data I have seen after that is till 30th of November, the consumer optimism survey by CMI. That shows no decline in consumer optimism. So, to the extent that is a surrogate indicator, there is no overall decline as opposed to impressions that are formed on the basis of what one reads about in the newspapers, watches television, which focus inordinately on the metros. You said economic activity will be affected. Of course, it will be affected. It will be affected in the obvious sectors like real estate, for example. But economic activity being impacted is not quite the same thing as GDP or gross value added being impacted. That's the point I am trying to make. So, there is an overall macro and there is a sector-wide impact. The sector-wide impact is obvious enough, but the overall macro impact on GVA or GDP is not very obvious to me.
Indeed. If I may just turn focus and talk to you about the other benefit that one speaks about as far as demonetization is concerned, which is digitization, which is moving to a cashless economy. Is there a certain obsession with being cashless? I mean, what's the big deal about being cashless? US isn't a cashless economy. Japan isn't a cashless economy. And I strongly believe that the economy needs to be more accountable than be cashless. Do you agree with me? Especially an economy like ours, where 90% or around those figure numbers are cash transactions.
Well, a little bit lower than 90%, but I will not quibble about the figures. The point, of course, is the use of cash has happened because of a whole lot of historical reasons, and therefore one cannot change it overnight. It is a gradual process. It is also true that there are disincentives today existing in the use of non-cash methods. For example, the kinds of charges on credit cards. So, you cannot obviously change everything to cashless overnight. That is not going to happen. But at the same time, one should have structures in place to facilitate the transition towards non-cash transactions, because the use of cash is too high in India, not only in comparison with the developed countries, but also in comparison with some of our neighboring countries. And the use of cash is not always very efficient. So, incrementally one needs to remove the disincentives against using non-cash methods and perhaps even put in place incentives so that people move towards less use of cash.
Debroy, the one thing that has happened post the 8th of November is plenty of speculation, and I'm just going to voice one of them, which is about how money will now be put in Jan Dhan accounts. The Prime Minister will live up to his promise of putting money in every accounts of poor people. Isn't that too blatantly populist an argument, and how come nobody in the government is out there denying it?
Well, because I think when one is saying government, there are three separate components, and all three in a very, very loose sense we use the government for. One is the money that actually comes into the consolidated fund. That is, strictly speaking, the government's money, and some of that, remember, has already been locked in, not into individual accounts, but into a specific scheme that ensures collective public goods. This is, I am talking specifically about the second income declaration scheme. Some of the money within quotes comes into the Reserve Bank, be it in the form of the extinguishing of liabilities or whatever. Now, the Reserve Bank's money is not the same thing as the government's money, and there are issues, legal issues included, of how one treats that. And the third one is money that is coming into public sector banks mostly, and other banks also. Now, all three are not in the same basket, and I think the reason the government is not explaining why, what, how and what will be done is because the budget is not all that far away, and all of these will figure in the budget, and one needs to be a little bit patient to understand what the government intends to do.
I wonder if the government can, after the Election Commission announces dates and there will be a moral code of conduct, put it in the accounts of these people. But you've actually prompted me to another debate and another question that's on the foreground, which is about a special dividend from the RBI. Yesterday, Governor Patel was on record to say that extinguished currency doesn't automatically get transferred as assets. It doesn't automatically take away the liability. So no question of a special dividend. Will rules of the game have to be changed? Will an ordinance perhaps make way for that special dividend to come to government?
Look, again, there are two separate, in the same question you are putting in two different arguments. The first argument is, strictly speaking, you cannot demonetize without some kind of legal backing. Whatever the Reserve Bank does under the RBI Act, it only enables the Reserve Bank to declare that currency will be in these particular denominations. The Reserve Bank cannot say that a currency that says, which is essentially in the nature of a promissory note, the Reserve Bank cannot say that if you come to me with an old 500 rupee note, I will refuse to exchange it for 100 rupee notes at a Reserve Bank as opposed to a commercial bank. So that kind of demonetization requires some legal backing over and above the Reserve Bank of India. The Reserve Bank of India Act is not good enough. So obviously, as in 1978, there will have to be ordinance or legislation. We next come to the question of the dividends. Whatever money does not come back, that to that extent, that's a reduction in the liabilities of the Reserve Bank. A reduction in the liabilities of the Reserve Bank is really a capital account transaction, whereas dividends come from a revenue account, a current account. So there is no automaticity about one changing into the other. Obviously, there are ways of doing it. There are other countries which have done it in the past. Germany has done it. So one has to wait to see what are the legalities and the formalities that will be observed in treating this. Until that is clear, any speculation that you might have or I might have is completely premature.
Just one last question before I let you go, Professor Debroy. It's 1 month on since demonetization was announced. The queues don't seem to be getting shorter outside banks. The government has stopped exchange, but there is very little cash available in ATMs all across the country. On hindsight, and you're known to be a candid man, do you believe this could perhaps have been better planned, more thoughtfully executed, more thoughtfully implemented perhaps?
Yes, of course, it could. The trouble, of course, is, look, there is always a trade-off. If you plan it perfectly, there was a danger of one not being able to ensure secrecy. That was the trade-off. Having said this, I think what was probably somewhat unexpected was the extent to which, I am talking about the exchange part, the extent to which people misuse the exchange channel. Now, obviously, it must have been anticipated that there would be some amount of misuse, but the degree of misuse was probably not anticipated, which is the reason why the rules were subsequently tweaked. So far as the shortage is concerned, you see, everyone has an impression about the shortage. My impression is that certainly in banks and certainly in Delhi, the queues have become shorter, although this tends to vary quite a bit, not only from one bank to another, but also from one branch of one bank to another branch of the same bank. There still seems to be a bit of a problem with the ATMs, but I would say that at least anecdotally and by observation, my impression is that the queues have definitely become shorter, especially if you are satisfied with 2000 rupee notes. If you want currency notes of lower denomination, there probably still is a bit of a distribution problem.
Indeed. But on that note, Professor Debroy, thanks very much for sparing time out and speaking to us as India completes 30 days of demonetization, one of the biggest monetary events that independent India has undertaken. But thanks very much indeed, Professor Debroy, for joining us. We take a quick breather, come back with plenty of news, views and of course perception that matters.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/etnow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at etnowlive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/etnow.